So in our last session, we talked about the Reformation. We talked about the way that the Protestant church was born and it exploded into different expressions of church. You had the Lutherans, you had the Presbyterians, you had the Anglicans. Everyone was broken up based on their different theologies. Now, during this time, it was usually the kings that were choosing what their people would be. So you would be Catholic if you were French or Irish or Spanish. You would be Lutheran if you were German or Scandinavian. You might be Presbyterian if you were from Scotland. And you were definitely Anglican if you were English. But what happens when you enter the New World? When you take a boat out of Europe and decide to go to a new land where there is no kings and there is an open, free religious marketplace. Today, we're going to talk about American Christianity and the ways that Christianity has been formed and moved in this United States of America. Before I get into the actual colonies of the United States of America, I do want to talk a little bit about the explorers that came before, right? We did have Catholic missionaries that came through Florida and Texas and New Mexico and California. And we also had Catholic Jesuits who went over the north. So we had a Catholic community here in the States before we ever had states. Now let's talk about those 13 colonies. Many of the people that were coming here were coming for religious freedom. They wanted to be able to believe and follow a Christianity that they felt was right for themselves. Usually these divisions weren't always laid by theologies, but by just hierarchy. Do I want a bishop? Do I want a pastor who has a pastor who has a pastor? Do I want people telling me how I'm supposed to worship? Do I want them to tell me what my church is able to do on a Sunday morning? If we are supposed to have communion every single Sunday, or if we can do it once a month or even once a quarter? How are we going to decide who gets to do what? And like I said, the American landscape is a free religious marketplace. And so the decisions were ultimately up to these new believers. The people that first came over on the Mayflower were Puritans. They were people that were fleeing the religious persecution in Europe because they wanted to worship differently. They wanted to do things differently than what their bishops or even their pope was telling them that they wanted to do. But they were Anglicans originally, before they came to the Americas, to this new world. So we have Puritan New England. Then we have Anglican Virginia, specifically Anglicans, that wanted to come over, not necessarily because they were fleeing religious persecution, but just because they wanted to be a part of this new world. New economic possibilities, new land to come and acquire. And so the Anglicans came over into Virginia. There were, like I said, Catholics throughout this land before we had the colonies, but Maryland became their home. If you were Catholic, it was very hard in the New World. They were trying to flee a lot of the Catholic rulers who were persecuting Protestants. And so when they came over, most of them were Protestants that were originally coming over, but there were some Catholics too that wanted to be a part of this new world, these new possibilities. And so the Catholics came over and they settled in Maryland, where there were less restrictions, less limitations for Catholics. Because even though we like to believe that it's a free religious marketplace, there was still judgments. There was still judging the other person based on their denomination. I think we can probably recognize that still today. What kind of Christian are you? These were questions that were still asked in the New World as America was beginning. And then finally, we have the Quakers in Pennsylvania. These Quakers were doing something completely different. They said, we don't even want a pastor. We don't want communion. We don't want liturgy. We don't want sacraments. We just want to be a people together in community. We're going to let that truck go by. So we had our Quakers in Pennsylvania that were choosing to do things completely differently. They wanted to have a space to profess their love of community and love of their brothers and sisters in Christ. And so they found this space in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania proved to be a pretty unique place, one of the colonies, because it allowed for a lot of different, unique places of religion. It's where we have the German Lutherans coming through. So this is a series for First Lutheran. So of course I had to shout out my Lutherans in Pennsylvania, but it's also where we get the Mennonites and the Amish and all of these kind of other ways of doing Christian religion that really do feel different and unique. Pennsylvania became their home and a place to just be themselves. So now we have this new world where there's no kings telling you which religion you have to be. You have neighbors who are of every different flavor. Yes, we have these little pockets of people that might look like you or act like you or pray or worship like you, but ultimately your neighbor could be of a different denomination than you. So what happens next? Well, America has this beautiful history of something called the Great Awakenings. So I'm going to move forward in history a bit to the 1730s and 40s. That is the first Great Awakening. The two big figures of this time are George Whitefield, who would preach in mass to thousands of people outside. He had these beautiful sermons that were emotional. He would constantly cry during his sermons, and he was able to tell the people in front of him that you can experience God too. He democratized religion in this way. Before, it was usually for those that could read the scriptures for themselves. They could read and write. But George Whitefield went out and said, no, everyone can encounter Christ. Everyone in this worship service in mass can experience the Spirit of God. There is no hierarchy. There is no expectations. There is no requirements. There is no exclusions. Everyone is included in the Church of Christ. Another name in this first Great Awakening is Jonathan Edwards, who famously wrote the essay, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. So you can probably guess where his theology went, that God was upset with us, that we have to repent, that we have to confess, that we have to change our ways, and ultimately not really a God of love. But God did love us so much that God wanted us to change. And so there was this great awakening. There were people coming to faith, changing their minds, coming into new expressions. What was intriguing about the first Great Awakening is that there was a split that started to become happening in all of the denominations. Are you going to go with this new spirit, or because it's got this emotion to it, the worship is different, it has a feeling that allows everyone to experience God bodily, not just in our minds or in our silent prayers, but actually to express it through the different gifts of the Spirit? Or are we going to be part of the old way of doing things? High liturgy, sitting in pews, singing hymns, and doing these things that we've done for generations and centuries. Will we try the new thing? That was what the first Great Awakening was about. Will we try the new thing? Because George Whitefield had brought a new thing, a new way to worship, a new way to experience God in a way that was available to large groups of people. And his emotional preaching really captured new audience members, really engaged people in ways that they hadn't had an engagement before. We also have the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s. This was similar in the way that it was a revival. Out on the frontier, as we moved out west, you would have these camp meetings that looked very much like George Whitefield's big groups. They would come together and they would have these emotional preachers speak to them, and they would consider how God is involved in their lives, how the Spirit might be moving, what their different spiritual gifts might be. During the Second Great Awakening, we have the emergence of the Baptist Church, full immersion baptism, and emotional preaching that really gathered in new people. We also had Methodism, which was originally founded in England by John Wesley, but it's where we get most of our hymns, even in the Lutheran Church today. We have influences of the Second Great Awakening in our churches today, even though we see ourselves as probably high liturgy and a part of that kind of old way of doing things. We still welcomed in the new Spirit moving in the Great Awakenings. John Wesley and his brother Charles wrote many, many hymns, and they changed the way that Anglicans did their worship out in England. And when it came over to the New World in Methodism, it was a new way of doing church together. It was a way that engaged everyone. Again, both the first and second Great Awakening were a democratizing of religion, meaning that no one was held out, everyone was welcome. Even the slaves and the slave owners could worship together. The poor, the sick, everyone was welcome. It was a very beautiful time that I think Jesus was probably proud of, to see that everyone could come and worship him and be a part of this movement and not feel like there were any limitations or exclusions on them because of the station they had in life that they were purely born into. Now, this had some consequences. When you democratize religion and you say everyone gets to be involved and everyone gets to be included and everyone has value because they are made in the image of God, what does that mean for slavery in America? The Great Awakening movement were a huge part of multiple social justice movements in this time in this timeline of the church and of America. The abolition movement was pushed forward by many of these Great Awakening churches. They said, I've been sitting next to this person in church and I've been worshiping with them, but they are a slave and I am a free person. That doesn't make sense. How can I fight for slavery? How can I fight to keep them in chains? I can't. And so the Great Awakening movement opened up their eyes to whether they will be a part of slavery or not in the New World. They also came to the understanding of prohibition and the temperance movement. Are we going to be a part of alcohol? Are we not going to be a part of alcohol? And what does that mean for the way that God is calling us into our lives? And finally, it also brought up the women's rights movement. These things came out of the Great Awakening movement. When you democratize religion and you say that it's available to all, you allow all to come to the table and you allow all to have the rights that they deserve. And so the women's rights movement also came out of the Great Awakenings movement. So after this great democratization of religion, we had to question bigger moves that are happening in America. The church would have to respond to things that were happening. They had already responded in the women's rights movement, they had already responded in the temperance movement, and they'd absolutely responded in the abolition movement. But what were they going to do when evolution came on the scene? And what were they going to do when biblical criticism was questioned? So we have these moments, these kind of cultural flashpoints in American Christianity. One is in 1906, when the Azusa Street Revival happened in Los Angeles, California. This was the move from the holiness movement of kind of considering our purity and how we're going to live a holy life. It moved into Pentecostalism. Now, Pentecostalism was a huge movement in America. In 1906, we had the Azusa Street Revival. So literally on the street, they were having worship services. They were singing songs. They were praying. There was movement of the Spirit in all of the kind of ways that we hear about it, speaking in tongues and interpreting those tongues and feeling healing services happening. These revivals were happening on the streets of Los Angeles, and it moved people and it brought people into Christianity that might not have been believers, or they had been a part of a different tradition that didn't have this Spirit-led movement in it. And so the Azusa Street Revival was a cultural flashpoint, a change in the way that American Christianity would forever be changed. Then there was the cultural flashpoint of the Scopes trial in 1925. Now, the Scopes trial was that pull between evolution and biblical criticism that I was just mentioning. John Scopes was the Scopes trial in 1925. John Scopes was on trial for what he believed to be preaching and teaching in his class in a high school, evolution. Was he truly teaching evolution? Some people are still questioning. He was eventually found guilty. He was fined something equivalent to a little over $1,000 in today's money. But ultimately, it didn't matter what the case decided. This became a cultural flashpoint. Would people in schools be allowed to learn about Darwin's theory of evolution? Would they be allowed to consider other ways of thinking that weren't a specific 7-day creation from the first book of Genesis? Were they able to hold up the biblical criticism that was starting to come out at this time, to look at original sources, to look at other documents, to consider what was happening in the wider ancient Near East when we look at our Bible. Are we supposed to read it as completely inerrant, without error, or is there interpretation to be had? Can you believe in the theory of evolution and still be a Christian? These were the debates that came out of the Scopes trial of 1925. And unfortunately, now one little teacher is forever known in this trial. But ultimately, like I said, it didn't matter if he was found guilty or not. It was the very fact that it came before a judge and a court to decide. So what ended up happening as a fault line began in American Christianity. With the rise of biblical scholarship, there became Protestant liberalism and fundamentalism. Where would you sit between these two polar opposites? And is there any middle in between? I do believe there is a middle in between, but these times in the early 1900s, we're truly questioning, what do we believe? How do we live it out? What does it mean to be Christian? What does a Christian believe? And it was the same question that they were asking back in the time of the New World. What will we believe? If we have every opportunity, and it's not a king telling us what we are going to ascribe to, what will we choose to label ourselves as? Will we be Christians? Will we be a particular denomination? And what does it mean when we claim a denomination? What's intriguing about American Christianity is the vast landscape. Now we are here in the modern age as a Christian, and we have to decide very similar things. What will we believe? Which church will we attend? Does it matter what label is on that church? Does it matter what our hierarchies say? What really matters? The early pilgrims had to decide this, and we have to decide it today. There are many questions that come out of this time, not just in the debates between fundamentalists and Protestant liberals and everything in between, but also, what does it mean to go out into the world today and choose a church? I didn't even talk about the many churches that started to come up in America that were specifically American, like Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ. Mormonism happened during this time period. What do we do with the Seventh-day Adventists? All of these little things popped up as well. Consider different off branches of the Christian faith. Were they true to the Bible? What does it mean to be true to the Bible? American Christianity now sits at a cultural point as well. We are seeing something called the rising of the nuns. Not N-U-N, like Catholic nun, but N-O-N-E-S. Meaning that when they're given a survey and asked, what do you believe? What church are you a part of? What are you willing to claim? They say none. They're not necessarily atheists. They're not necessarily anything, but they're not willing to claim a particular denomination or even claim a particular institution. What does that mean for the church today when we say none on a political survey, on a religious survey? How will the American landscape continue in Christianity? Will we see a decline of the main line? Because we've already seen a decline in the main line. We've seen a plateauing of the Pentecostal traditions, and we have an expansive growth happening in the non-denominational churches, who honestly differ from any church to any church on what they believe. You have to look at their website to figure out, what do you believe? What am I going to get on a Sunday morning? So what does it mean for the everyday Christian to walk and be a Christian in the modern age? Knowing this history, knowing that we are not the first to ask these questions, but we are having to answer them for ourselves today. Which church will you go visit this Sunday? Which church will you be a part of? And what matters to you when you choose that church? Is it community? Is it theology? Is it the way that they set themselves up on a Sunday morning? Is it the worship that you experience? We have everything available in the American free religious marketplace. What are you going to choose and why?